With that, I'm going to pass the mic over to Kathryn Colasanti, academic specialist at the Center for Regional Food Systems and chair of our impact subcommittee, along with Caitlin Joseph, who's been consulting on this project to better understand perspectives of food service staff in publicly funded universities.
Great, thank you, Abby. I think I'm going to have you advance the slides, Abby. Cool. So I'm just going to share really briefly the overview of this project and some of the background and context, and then I will turn it over to Caitlin. So a while back, MFIN leadership decided to put some energy towards engaging a new sector of institutions. You guys probably know we have had our most traction with public schools and with hospitals. So the idea was we could put some concerted effort and branch out to other types of institutions a little bit. So the question was posed to the MFIN Advisory Committee whether the network should focus on institutions of higher education or senior care facilities. And that group ended up recommending higher education institutions. So from there, we decided to focus specifically on Michigan's public universities, partly just to keep the scope manageable. There are 15 public universities in Michigan. And then also those are some of the largest institutions of higher ed in the state. And so collectively they represent a huge portion of the food served in the higher ed setting. So before we could really determine as a network how best to engage this sector, we decided we really just needed to better understand the current landscape of local food purchasing in these settings. So I brought this idea to the Research and Impact Subcommittee in a meeting last fall. So it was around September 2018. And that group helped think through what a project could look like and helped develop an interview tool. And then if you've been participating in these meetings regularly, you may also remember I introduced this project to this group in, I think it was also September of 2018, just to share where we're headed. So we started then with interviews, and now we're at the stage of synthesizing our draft findings. And then later this summer in August, we will be bringing together representatives from the food service programs at these public universities, and then use their input both to further interpret what we're seeing in our draft findings from the interviews, and then also get their thoughts on how we can best work together in furthering local purchasing in their food service settings. So we'll use all of that input along with the draft findings that we'll be presenting here today to put together a public report, which we hope to complete and release by the end of this year. So that's a really quick overview, background, and context of the what and the why. And with that, I will turn it over to Caitlin Joseph, who's been conducting the interviews and synthesizing the findings for us.
Great, thanks, Kathryn. Hi, everyone. I'm Caitlin Joseph. I'm based in California right now, but was in Michigan for about 5 years. A lot of work on regional systems in Southeast Michigan and some partnership with MSU throughout. So I've been working with Kathryn and Colleen over the years on a couple of different inquiries, like Kathryn mentioned, in terms of expanding out into various institutions. And just wanted to provide some framing around the public universities work itself. Part of what Kathryn mentioned is this question of which institutions are useful to start looking into in terms of expanding MFIN's reach. And we know that there are these 15 public universities in Michigan, and that there's some ways that their food service settings differ from other types of institutions. So one, we know that higher education is in general kind of sets trends for a variety of different topics in society. So they can really be kind of reproducing social construct social norms, but also innovating on those based on being, kind of these research and innovation hubs. So just in terms of their kind of place in the larger context, they're an interesting institution to consider. They also have a fewer barriers in terms of regulations around like nutritional guidelines compared to K through 12 schools, as well as some senior and long-term care facilities that might be beholden to, considering patients' needs, or and in terms of hospitals as well, patients' needs or different dietary needs. So lots of opportunities within universities. And this slide shows the 15 that are in Michigan, and we were able to interview 14 of these 15. Wayne State declined to be interviewed, but we were able to gather some general information about their food service program through a bit of literature review and just kind of past context that we know from our partners across the state. We can go to the next slide. So we can see that across the state, those 15 universities are pretty geographically dispersed. So we did have 3 universities in the Upper Peninsula that we were able to get a hold of as part of this research. Next slide. In terms of the interview, we gave kind of a broad scope. So we just wanted to get at first a description of the food service program, some basic demographics of the school, the food service director's history of local food purchasing, what are some of their interests and motivations around local food purchasing, and then some of the barriers and challenges that they're facing. And so it was a combination of pretty specific questions that they were also able to provide like numeric estimates for certain questions, and then a few that were a bit more open-ended. So the analysis kind of reflects both of those. Next slide. Next slide, please. Thanks. Okay, so we'll move into the findings at this point. And let's see. So starting off with the number of meals. So and just to note, the findings I'll go through today are not everything that we asked about or were covered in the research. We just wanted to pull out a few highlights that we thought this group might be interested in. So keep an eye out for more detail in the coming months. So to start, we were able to interview those 14 universities, and within 14, 11 reported some estimates on their annual meal numbers. So across those 11, we know that the total annual meals served was more than 17 million. And this graphic shows an estimated breakdown of that total by meal type. So we can see that lunch accounts for the largest amount. Catered meals are also not insignificant, so something to notice. All right, and we also asked folks about the minimally processed produce that they frequently purchase. So just wanted to get a sense of what are they already purchasing produce-wise, and we broke this question down into minimally processed and then whole produce. So this is for those minimally processed produce items. You can see the number of universities that noted that they purchase each of these products in large quantities. So lettuce, shredded or chopped, really stands out as the most frequently purchased minimally processed item. One university, the reason this is, oh, sorry, yours shows 14, but there was one university that said that they try to minimize bringing in pre-processed foods. So they did not actually list any specific items that they purchased pre-processed. And that was a general theme throughout. A lot of folks really said they're trying to move away from pre-processed and towards more whole foods. So you can see a few of the others that stand out from this list, though, are processed carrots, broccoli, and frozen corn. Salad mixes, pre-cut fruits were also high on that list for several of the institutions we interviewed. Next slide. Great. And so for whole produce, we can see that there's some of these that, obviously are not grown in Michigan. So based on what the majority of universities are already purchasing as whole produce that could be gleaned from Michigan producers, apples, tomatoes, and onions really stand out as some of those potential Michigan-grown items that could be substituted into operations that are already purchasing these in large quantities. Melons, carrots, cucumbers, lettuce, and potatoes are also purchased by about more than 40% of the public universities that were interviewed for the study. So that was the 6 out of 14. Next slide. And then we also asked participants what the main local products that they had been purchasing. So this was in a more open-ended manner. The previous 2 questions, we had a few options that folks could choose from, and then they were also able to just list some of their top products. This one was quite a bit more open-ended. So the synthesis here really represents kind of generating the themes from what folks said. So a lot of participants listed items that display on their distributors' reports as coming from local sources, and many noted that they are not sure of the product's exact origin as a result of just using the distributors list. So several also know some ongoing relationships that they have with local vendors or even a campus farm as some specific sources of local foods. So these responses kind of reflect that full range of different kinds of relationships with local food. Several of the participants, about 5, listed just produce as a general broad category of the foods they purchased from local sources. So because this category is less specific than the others that participants provided, it was not included on this visualization as its own category. Instead, a count was added to specific products that are grown in large volumes in Michigan, so are most likely to be covered under that general produce category that they can get in through major distributors. So those would include apples, cabbage, potatoes, root vegetables, and then summer and winter squash. So just something to keep in mind as you're taking a look at this visualization, but we can see the apples really stand out, dairy, potatoes, root vegetables, summer squash, cabbage, winter squash. Those are some big items that folks are already getting in locally. I was also encouraged and somewhat surprised to hear about a couple of the specific relationships that folks had with different local protein sources. So there's a few different fish like whitefish and lake trout, pork, including a forward contract with a pork producer, and then turkey and a few other protein sources noted. Next slide. In terms of products from local sources in the future, we asked folks what their interest might be, and some broader categories stood out. So produce really was the main thing that folks emphasized, and there was some themes within that. So really things that were available year-round stood out as the produce that folks are most interested in purchasing, just based on the way that menus are planned. And then a few really noted that they would love to get more processed produce. So even though in the earlier questions there was kind of an emphasis on moving away from processed produce, folks thought it would be easier to get started substituting local in if they can access more kind of minimally processed produce from local sources. Meat and dairy stood out as well, but folks really mentioned that they would love to get meat and dairy that have sustainability certifications. So that was something to note there in terms of what they're really looking for when they're looking for local. It also is sustainable. And similarly with chicken and eggs, there's a lot of demand for cage-free that they're hearing from either administrators or students at schools as something that they're seeking in the future. Next slide. So here are some a breakdown of kind of what we noticed. Folks were mentioning the response to local foods among their student community and school community broadly when local foods are served. It's a pretty even split between positive and neutral, and one institution said that they don't really know, they don't really keep track. And just a couple of notes on the data. The information on responses to local foods was collected through an open-ended question and then subsequently categorized as positive or neutral. And one institution in their answer highlighted that they observed very positive responses when there was brand recognition for among the student population for the local product that they served. And then pretty neutral responses for products that they served that didn't have that brand recognition, which constitutes the majority of products that they were currently serving. So this institution was represented in the neutral column, but if you account for this, the responses seem even more evenly split between positive and neutral. So just something to think about, you know, what do we think is really happening here? And wanting to kind of question, is generating a positive response an important goal that we should be asking universities to track, or is this something that they're really concerned with? Is how students and the different customers or users of the food are actually responding to local foods when it's served. And then also interesting to consider how these responses might compare to food served with other attributes. So either cage-free eggs or some of those other sustainability certifications that institutions are interested in right now. Next slide. And then we had another open-ended answer for understanding the motivations that folks have around bringing in more local food. So participants shared some of the factors that most motivate them to purchase local foods for their program. And really the higher quality and freshness of local foods stand out, as well as the opportunity to support the local economy. These are some of the strongest motivations for folks. Food service directors reported being equally motivated by pressure from their students as by the potential environmental benefits and business incentives. So you can see some of those middle range responses all kind of fit within that. And then let's see. One university also mentioned health promotion as a factor that they really had in mind. And then another expressed pressure and encouragement from higher offices, such as local politicians and campus administration. So there's both this kind of grassroots pressure from the students and the school community represented, and then the kind of top-down pressure from folks higher up above the food service director themselves. So noticing those different pathways for these messages getting to the food service director. Next slide. And then we asked a couple of questions about some of the barriers and challenges that folks are facing in terms of getting local foods into their program. So again, these were open-ended, and we tried to provide some framing around what might be more internal challenges, so things especially related to logistics and equipment, staffing, that kind of thing. This was what was reflected in this first question. We broadly categorized this in terms of internal barriers because folks also ended up mentioning some purchasing policies within their institution, like some limitations within the contracts that were mentioned by a couple of people. So one thing to notice here, especially as we compare to the next question to follow, is that there were a good number of people that really noted that their primary barriers are not internal. So, you know, some of the things that folks did mention as kind of logistical challenges were lack of storage or some challenges around the distribution infrastructure. So folks especially mentioned like traffic in town and dock space and just the challenges involved in getting multiple deliveries in, and they just can't manage multiple trucks coming into the dock space per day or per week. that was something that folks noticed. And let's see. In terms of labor, folks mentioned two different challenges within that. So some folks mentioned that there's lack of labor. So in terms of there's only so many hours that they can assign folks to prepare local foods, and then that their staff could use some more training on how to prepare fresh local foods. But these were not emphasized in terms of major challenges that were really creating huge make or break roadblocks. Next slide. So some of these external barriers had a lot more emphasis in folks' answers to the barriers that they're facing. So the largest number of universities really listed a lack of sufficient volume for local products that they're interested in as the main barrier. Many really said not only is this a barrier, it is the chief barrier that they face. And among those that commented on volume challenges, one emphasized the need for more minimally processed local food. And then what intertwined with the lack of sufficient volume is the lack of year-round availability of local products, which 6 universities listed as their main barrier. And then most planned menus, months in advance. So many express that having that consistent and sufficient volume of ingredients throughout the year is important to being able to streamline local foods into their regular program. 5 respondents mentioned challenges related to the inconvenience that they and their chefs experience with sourcing local foods. So directors expressed the unsustainability, for example, of chefs having to call multiple producers or specialty distributors to kind of piece together the volume that they need. And others highlighted challenges associated with onboarding new vendors into the billing system, and that can be an added burden even when it's small or inconsistent orders that they're getting from those folks. So that kind of inconvenience really is coupled with the volume barrier as well. And then related to the inconvenience for the institution, some participants reflected feedback that they heard from suppliers, local suppliers, that the institutional payment systems are pretty inconvenient and cumbersome for farmers as well. So several participants mentioned this, but they also said that this kind of challenge was something that's pretty surmountable, and they even started to offer some potential solutions that could be implemented in systems on their end or by farmers or food hubs in order to kind of surmount that barrier. And then 5 participants listed budget and price challenges as barriers, which, with themes of this suggesting that most directors feel that local producers should be paid fair prices for their products, especially noting that they do feel that they are higher quality, but that they lack the power to decide that they can spend more on such products. So there's challenges related to that just a caveat to note that folks really wanted to be able to pay a fair price for those products. And then food safety and liability concerns came up for 4 and 3 universities respectively. So 4 for food safety, 3 for liability. And these concerns were really framed around the need for local producers to become more integrated with distributors that can take on the verification aspects of those pieces for their suppliers. So it's not. So while some mentioned that they had issues with quality in the past that could have posed food safety risks, the majority, were more concerned with food safety and liability primarily because it's a requirement in their operations and not necessarily that they experience a lower quality from local producers. And then another 4 participants expressed that there seem to be few producers in their immediate area that are interested or able to supply them. Some saw it as primarily a geographic or issue growing region. Three within that emphasize that existing or interested growers just aren't ready to supply them due to lacking certifications, or their business operations just aren't at capacity, or there's not sufficient coordination with neighboring growers. And within that, I also can note that a few folks, had moved themselves from different parts of the state and had experienced, farmers in different regions being a little bit more coordinated than in other areas, but also noted that part of it may be that they just are not educated on who to connect with in their new region. So definitely, a communication element that goes into that piece about the lack of local producers in the area. Some kind of said that with a caveat that they know it may just be something that they're not aware of. So in terms of these barriers, it's interesting for MFIN to consider, what are the leverage points that as a network we can address, and then which of these are our highest priority areas for us to focus in on. Next slide. And then to close out the interview, participants were asked about one thing that would best enable them to increase their local purchasing. So this was kind of the $6 million question. And folks really, took a pause before they answered this, and really tried to boil down everything that they had mentioned in the interview. And this elicited some pretty clear and passionate responses from folks. So this was actually my favorite question to ask, to analyze. So, some universities offered more than one suggestion. So in those cases, their responses were kind of counted again for each of the themes that they fell into. But some themes did clearly emerge, and that's what this list reflects. So, so the first one was a simplified or aggregated and more centralized system for ordering local products. So just addressing that inconvenience and the volume piece together. And then number two is price parity for local products. Not something we really asked a ton of questions about in terms of, were folks experiencing higher costs, but that was something that bubbled to the surface in this answer. And then higher volumes of products of interest, or getting access to working with larger farms that are willing to forward contract for some of those products of interest. Number four was more farmers getting approved to sell through institutions, own their regular wholesale distributors. So there was this came up throughout several of the other questions in the interview, that the folks really are used to going through their broadline distributors, and or even some of the specialty distributors that they're able to contract with, and really want to purchase from local farmers through those channels to the extent that's possible. And then number five was assistance with discovering some of those local folks that they might be able to purchase from, or just local products that are on the existing list from their suppliers currently. And then, this was also an alternative way of phrasing this, was to hire their own local food forager that they could have on staff. Number six was a variety of strategies for the state of Michigan to support this process through some incentives. So that could include incentives to institutions themselves in the form of tax credits, or incentives for farmers to really consider putting acreage into sale contracts for institutions. And then finally, at least one institution in this question mentioned that there's policies within their own contract as a food service company. So in this case, this would be for not the self-op institutions, rather the folks that have a contracted food service company that they're working with, to try and find opportunities for some more leniency in what the contract language looks like. And one thing interesting to note on this is that in an earlier question, two folks mentioned these kind of contract limitations or internal policies as one of the internal barriers that they face. So even though only one institution noted this as kind of a top factor that could enable them, there were two that mentioned this as an internal barrier. So just something to consider. Next slide. And then one thing I wanted to note as well, a lot of the data that we're sharing right now are from the interviews themselves. We also were able to conduct a literature review around some similar studies that have been conducted around the country. And that literature review shed light a bit on some of the tracking methods that universities around the country are utilizing to track their local purchases and understand their baseline. So this is something, when we look at areas for future inquiry within Michigan, this could be a deeper dive that we might consider to look into with Michigan universities, is to understand what methods they're already using, if there's any particular pieces of software or other technologies that have been helpful in tracking their local purchases. And then a few other areas that we could consider in the future. Our interviews didn't specifically ask how food service directors promote local foods when they do get them in, but this came up loosely in some of the open-ended answers. So future research could focus in more on this question to better understand how this relates to some of the reactions we're seeing from customers when local foods are served, is coupling with when you serve foods, like what are the different methods that you use to promote them, and what do we know from research that about how what methods are the most effective in eliciting a positive response from consumers or customers. And then coupled with that, it's interesting to consider even who is the customer and who really is driving demand, and to what extent are those reactions from customers changing the purchasing decisions. So this came up especially when speaking with a few of the institutions that are third-party food service managed. So these folks really noted that they didn't so much see the students at universities as the customers, but rather the university administration or other folks at those higher levels that are actually making decisions on whether to contract with this company again, or understanding their potential at other institutions to gain contracts based on how their performance is being viewed at the institutions that they're currently contracted with. So the values and desires of university administration really might have some sway more than students in the school community, depending on how the food service manager is understanding who their customer is. So that could really signal different leverage points that MFIN might focus on for kind of driving more values-based purchasing. And then in terms of the impact of farm to school, we started to notice that there's been some anecdotal evidence that points to really a shifting culture among students in higher education settings that are really showing up to college with a more expanded palate and more interest in diverse fruits and vegetables, maybe even more nuanced kind of concerns about their food system. And especially since MFIN has been working closely in the K through 12 space for so long, this could be a really interesting question to consider, is the extent to which some of that work being done to promote farm to school and K through 12 has been impacting higher ed settings. And then finally, understanding the impact of higher ed food programs on community food security. So we know that universities are becoming increasingly aware of food security as an issue for many of their own students, and are taking steps to address that for students in their communities. So future research might consider a variety of angles on this topic. So how local food promotion and higher ed food service might interact with community food security in a variety of ways. So for example, our food service programs ensuring that any higher costs associated with local foods are not passed on to students, and thus creating, a higher debt burden or just a different financial situation for students. And then also important to consider whether, strong local food contracts with universities could, support or expand access to fresh, healthy food in communities where it's lacking. So lots of different interesting questions to consider around food security as well.
So thank you to everyone for being on today and for sharing your knowledge and wisdom with the group and ideas. We will be in touch about many of these topics in the future, and hope to see many of you at the next network call on July 18th. So thanks everybody, we'll be signing off.